You're listening to the Entrepreneur's Agony Aunt podcast, keeping it real, telling the story like it is, because there are no mistakes that somebody else hasn't already made. Hello, I'm Vicky Brock, and you're listening to the Entrepreneur Agony Aunt podcast. Back by popular demand, his as well as yours, is Mark Logan, IOD Director of the Year, former Skyscanner COO, Startup Advisor and NXD. So welcome back to my living room, Mark.
Thank you, Vicky.
One question this week, which is distilled down from one that was submitted in and also as highlighted by CEO Tom Adula in episode 16. And it is, as our business grows, none of the things that worked well before, none of the things that I am good at, seem to be working. Our productivity is falling, we're not hiring as well as we did, and as CEO I feel increasingly distant from the mechanics of the business, which scares me. Is this normal, and how do I fix it so that we don't self-destruct? I know that this is a question that you've spoken about before. I want to kick off with your general thoughts about what's behind this question.
Sure. So if you stand back and say what are the two main reasons why startups fail, I'd say there's firstly the issue of did we really understand product market fit, and there's a lot that could be said about that. But on the assumption that your startup gets that right, and that's a big assumption, but the assumption that it does, then the second reason that startups and indeed larger organisations tend to get lost and sometimes fail is because of organisational design. It's the thing that we tend not to focus on because it maybe doesn't sound as exciting as product and all the things that go with that. But it's absolutely crucial to understand that as a leader of a startup, as much of your time should be invested in how we do things as in what we do. Now, the problem here is that this is not a static consideration. How you do things successfully at one level of scale changes, it has to change at other levels of scale. And the kind of generic problem that you're describing here, Vicky, to my mind, is that we tend to double down on what used to work at the point where we should change everything. So, for example, let's imagine that you and I start a company, and on a Friday afternoon we get together at the local pub and talk about plans for next week. And that works really well for the first 10 employees, first 15, but then it starts not to work so well because some people can't make it to the pub because they've got children to pick up, or they don't want to go there, or they're busy that afternoon. And suddenly you find that 30 employees, 15 of them resent you for not communicating properly because you haven't updated your communications mechanism. Now that's a trivial example, but it's a small example of the systemic problem, which is that three things change as your business grows. The processes that you operate, the dynamics, if you like, the structures in which you operate those processes, and the people who actually populate them. The interplay of these three things is what needs to be updated as the business grows. And that's the root of many of our problems, because we fail to update them or we fail to model them and think about them explicitly.
At each of those touch points, are there different or indeed similar signs that come through that are an indication to you that maybe it's time to step up to the next mark? And how do you get there?
Yes, absolutely. So let's drill into that a little bit. The first thing is let's give these points a name. So let's call these organisational inflection points. And you can characterise them as you're adding people for a while and you get correspondingly increased outcomes. And then you continue to add people, but the rate of outcomes drops off. So either you're not getting any more, or in some cases you're getting less outcomes.
Yeah, because suddenly new problems pop up and things go wrong that didn't expect to. And
yes, or a team's productivity paradoxically suddenly collapses, so you get less done because of these prior issues of process, people, and structure, and how they interplay. So how do you know if you're in one of those inflection points? Well, I would say that usually you don't know you're in one until you're very deeply into one. But the way you get early indication, it's not revenue or user growth or any of those kind of things. It will certainly show up in those in due course. But it's important to think of those as lagging indicators. The mistakes you make today, you will see in next year's revenue, if you're lucky enough to still have revenue next year. But the leading indicators for this is usually frustration amongst your people, especially your best people. People who used to be engaged and fulfilled in the business are now registering frustration at you and at the general circumstances and at each other. And teams tend to turn on each other in these inflection points because, the thing we're best at as humans is arriving at plausible reasons for stuff, which aren't necessarily the actual reasons. And one of their favourite plausible reasons is, that guy's a bozo. That's the problem. If only you get rid of him, it'll all be much better. So that's the way to tell you're in one, is that you start to see rising frustration and you don't quite know why, and that's the indicator.
Interesting. I certainly experienced that about the 30 people mark, exactly as you suggested. But do they replicate themselves in a similar way, each kind of inflection point, however much that has scaled up?
Yes, very much so. So my experience of both being in these circumstances and working with other companies who are in them, there's a geometric progression, and at some point we'll give it a name. But for now, the progression is round about 30 to 50 people, round about 100, round about 200, 400, 800, and so on. You will hit these inflection points. And the thing that's changing, which brings them about, is you're adding people to the business, which causes the three things we mentioned earlier, people, process, and structure, to scale out. And the way you get through these inflection points is quite a counterintuitive thing. You have to change everything. So you don't double down on what used to work. You have to change your structures for sure, the dynamics and processes you operate the structures with. And you have to change people. And when I say change people, I don't mean you have to fire everybody and hire new people. That's sometimes necessary. But you have to change how your people how you as a person operate within the company as well. And it takes an enormous amount of effort to get through these inflection points. Sometimes the business starts to spend all of its energy in transforming itself, and hence there are less outcomes than before, which can cause panic on your board for a while. But recognise that when you hit an inflection point, a lot of energy is going to have to be spent on it.
And is it something that you can slightly prepare for in advance by either budgeting for or thinking about personal development, your own as well as your team's? Or is it something that you have to live through it once, survive it, to recognise it and be prepared for next time?
Well, there's theory and practice here now. In practice, it's one of these things that most people don't believe this phenomenon exists until they've experienced it. So trying to explain to somebody before they've had the first experience that it's going to happen is difficult. Now, after you've experienced it, and there's a real value, I believe, in modelling situations. So rather than just say, well, that was a left field issue that almost killed the company, now let's move on to greater glory. If you can stand back and say there's a model here, and the model is every doubling of staff, for example, we're going to hit an inflection point, then you can start to mitigate and prepare for the inflection point. It's I think impossible to avoid them, but you can shorten the duration by being more aware of them. And to answer how do you prepare for them, let's talk about, when we say change everything, change it to what goal is the key question, because if we understand to what end we're changing things, then we can start to make some of those changes or be ready for them before the actual need arises in greater sort of traumatic circumstances. So the way to think about how to navigate these inflection points is the variable I think you want to hold constant. So it's not a variable, it's a constant. Is agency. Now let's define agency. Agency is competent people, reasonably well aligned to the strategy of the business, who have the ability to make decisions without referring up many chains of approval, and have the resources to get that done. Now, if you think about the first 4 employees in a company, it's a pretty safe bet that all of them have agency.
Yeah.
That you can do all the things I just mentioned. You might be a founder, etc. Think about employee on 104 or 504. If you can honestly say that they have the same agency that you had when you were employee 4, then you're doing just fine. But I think we all know that the severe likelihood is that agency tends to drop over time. But our goals as leaders in these companies is to maintain agency as near to its originating level per capita later, as it was, as at the start. So that means that, I'll give you a practical example of that. If I'm at 200 people and I see frustration levels rising, probably when I talk to people, and you should go to the front line of your business and ask, why. You will find that people can't get stuff done. And then what you want to start doing is trying to diagnose with those people why they can't get stuff done. And then reinstate agency by, for example, creating structures where decision making is further devolved to the front of the business, and ensuring that staff can competently operate that agency, which is to say that they are heavily capable in operating within a large company. They understand the latest techniques for releasing software at scale, or for automating testing, or for collaborating at scale. You've got to invest in all that stuff. Now, if we go a step back before you've hit those inflection points, if you're monitoring the agency almost as one of these qualitative metrics, on a paranoid basis, so you're always looking for drops in agency, you're always speaking to the front line of your business and finding out what they think, and encouraging them to critique the operating environment, then the chances are you'll put more of these things in place before you need them, and that can help. So
it's not about, are you happy, are you motivated? It's about, do you have self-determination? Do you have the agency to do what it is that you need to do? It's interesting because you talk about that frustration and everybody falling out. And I definitely lived through that. And it came exactly in that period when I was trying to extract myself out of day-to-day decisions. I'd been that early founder, who kind of like accidentally briefs product because they just had a great idea in a meeting, forgetting that was a product meeting, and now they just changed the roadmap by mistake. I knew that you have to extract yourself from that. I brought in certain manager roles. I brought in, say, a CTO. I brought in an FD, and I suspect that probably some of my original team or my early team were quite frustrated by that because they were doers, and now there were non-doers coming into the team. And it took me a little while to pick up what all of this frustration was about. And we tried to solve it. We were edging towards the right thing, but with no path. We started to try to figure out everybody's responsibilities and accountabilities, because one of the symptoms we were getting was this is manifesting itself as, I can't do my job because they don't do their job well enough, or they're not doing their bit properly, so that's holding up my problem, or nobody's being clear about what's my responsibility and what's their responsibility. And very quickly it became a huge mess of things that I'm appalling at. You're probably good at because you're from an operational perspective, but process maps and dependencies and responsibility and attributions are not my strength. But I'm assuming that was probably a symptom of exactly that thing. To roll it back a little bit, if now going back into that prepared, what would be a better way to kind of handle that?
Well, so let's run those scenarios again. And this time you are pre-prepared with a paranoia around the agency index. Now, the discussions, some of the things you just mentioned there, I can't get anything done unless they do their bits. Now, what we've just described there is one of the things that removes agency, which is dependencies. I depend on those people, and as a company gets bigger, their priorities, to some extent, necessarily become overlapping but not fully aligned to mine. Therefore, I'm waiting on them, and therefore I've lost agency because I can't act. So one of the things when you're re-engineering your company structures is to ensure that the things that need to get done, that you've minimised handoffs and dependencies. And that's a question of structure. So, for example, a classic example of a transformation there is moving from a structure which is very heavily functionally siloed into one where multidisciplinary people are located in the same unit. You've removed handoffs there because they've now got the same mission. So there's a clue there in the alignment issue. You mentioned that adding managers didn't necessarily help. So let's again look at this through the agency lens, to overuse that in that metaphor. Now, when you were the person who made all the decisions, you had agency, you decided things, you got them done. As the company grows, as we add people, your vector distance from the front line of the business increases. So therefore, if you're still the decision maker, then the latency in your decisions increases too, and you don't really know what's happening in the front line of the business to the same level that the people in the sales team or marketing team know for their areas. So your quality of decision making goes down, and they become more passive because they don't feel that they're making any of these decisions. Now let's say that you now drop in a layer of management to fix that problem. Well, if you think about it, you haven't really fixed it, because it's not necessarily the case that that layer of management has any more proximity to the issues than you do. They do in the organisational chart, but have they ever done that job in your company? Have you given them authority to make decisions on your behalf, or was that something you thought you communicated? Had you made them competent to make those decisions, like really, really properly onboarded them over 6 months? They may feel superficially they're ready, but when it comes to big decisions, they'll come and refer to you, or they won't make decisions, or they'll get into groups of other managers and make consensual decisions, which are never the best decisions. The people who are still out in those leaf nodes in front of the business aren't seeing any real improvement in service. So you've got to start to get agency. You don't start from, the founder and work towards the edge of the business. You consider it from the edge of the business and work in. And if you can say, well, that layer of management does create agency for these people for these reasons from their perspective, you're probably going to be okay. But that's the question to ask. With every change you make, does that keep agency the same? Raise it or lower it for the people on the front line of the business? Mm-hmm. And by the way, when I say agency, I don't mean autonomy. Yeah. Autonomy I define as, I can do whatever I want, but I'm not necessarily competent to do it. Agency is, I can do what needs to get done to align to the overall mission of the company, but I am also competent to execute that. There's a clue there for maintaining agency means maintaining competence. Yeah. And being a leader of a 3-person marketing team, leader of a 50-person marketing team requires different competences. So investing in your people through that journey is likely to keep that agency in the front.
Taken to its extreme then, does that mean your hiring process is almost in reverse, in that instead of you as a CEO or a founder, you're thinking, right now I need some managers, now I need a team lead. It's almost like as you're seeing your people at the edge there struggling or at the limit of their competency or at the limit of their capacity, you're thinking, okay, right, what do I now need to add either to this team or to a working group to take that to the next level of required competency? How does that... Because it's interesting, because in the question, and I really relate to this, the person says we're not hiring as well. I'm not actually sure that is true. It's not necessarily that you're not hiring as well, it's that these teams are working as well and you're not getting these people onboarded as well. But is it because the thinking is the wrong way up?
Well, it's a very good point. I highly favour, could be criticised for this view, but I highly favour a minimalist approach to building hierarchy. So I would tend to want to build the minimum, oversight that allows the team to still function. We often build structures and then populate them, on a kind of top-down basis. But if you put agency at the front, you would take a slightly different view to that. It's always better to have too few people than too many in a business, because one of the things, and maybe the major thing that takes away agency, is time spent operating the bureaucracy of the business. Now let's take a real example. One of the things that's necessary for agency is alignment. So for example, from the CEO and for that matter the board through to the front line of the business, everybody understands the mission and the objectives, and within that reality you can operate with a high degree of autonomy because you're aligned, and I know you're aligned, so therefore I'm not worrying about what you're doing. Now, that all sounds wonderful. A lot of businesses make the mistake of increasing the level of alignment, because surely more alignment must be better than less alignment. But what they don't realise that they're doing is they're creating a bureaucracy to operate that alignment, and that bureaucracy exponentially sucks time from the actual job itself. So let's say that we decide every 3 months we're going to all get together and align our objectives and make sure that they all get aligned on the same day and they're all reportable in the same format. We build a tool to support that, etc., etc. Then one day we wonder why our productivity is dropping. We ask our frustrated people and they say, I can't get any work done around here because I'm in another alignment meeting. And as you add management, there's always going to be an inevitable increase in a bureaucracy. And bureaucracy is not a bad thing, but too much of it is a bad thing. And we don't set out to create too much bureaucracy. We set out to solve a problem and then unwittingly create the bureaucracy that comes with it. So given that paranoia is the watchword here, given a paranoia about things that remove agency, you will think very carefully about management and many layers of management. And I would rather people got frustrated because they felt the task was too big, and that's the signal to hire, than felt frustrated because there was too many people stirring the pot, too many managers to defer to, too many consensual decision-making sessions, etc.
Yeah, interesting. And I know I made that mistake. And I think when I was deep in that mistake, it was hard to see a way out of it, except to retreat back to what I knew, which was to make it smaller again. I almost kind of really wanted, when the wheels was falling off everything at 30, what I really wanted to do was to go back to 10, where I felt like I had it right and have another shot at doing it differently, which isn't really very workable either. And I suppose it was definitely, we were in a kind of crazy situation of getting less and less done because we were having more and more meetings. And the costs have trebled because that's a really expensive layer to add in. And I think probably it wasn't a layer that we needed at 30 people. Maybe we at 70, at 80 people, maybe, probably, who knows. But I think we were trying to follow a blueprint of what an organisation should look like long before we needed to look like that. And we weren't listening internally enough. I wasn't listening internally enough, or didn't actually necessarily have the skills to be structuring that in a way that would work better. You talk about measuring agency. Any examples of how? I mean, is there a metric you use with that? Do you survey people? Do you walk the floor? All of the above?
That's a great question, because I've come to the conclusion over the years that there are some really great pseudo-qualitative metrics that, were you able to measure them, would be, in a very accurate way, would be great. But just because you can't easily measure them doesn't really reduce that much their value. So the presence, let's imagine we took your business and split it or cloned it. So we've now got two businesses identically set up. And then one goes forward with this idea that everybody in the company thinks about agency. Another company, that concept doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Now although there are ways to measure agency with proxies like, productivity and frustration levels, these are all worthwhile things to do. But just the presence of having the concept of, is the agency of employee 504 same as employee 104, etc., will change behaviours and change how you think about problems. So, for example, when you sit with your senior team and say, let's design the organisation, you wouldn't say, other organisations have a layer of management here, we should have one. You would say, what change will increase agency or maintain it as we grow? You might well conclude that extra management is required, don't get me wrong, that's often helpful, but you would conclude it from a different direction with different emphasis. So there are other places in life, I mentioned frustration levels. It's not that you can hold a frustration meter up and measure frustration, but by being
sometimes it comes at you like a big wave. It's sort of like the weather forecast. You can feel it.
Yeah, you know it when you see it, and therefore, not having it on a chart doesn't mean it's not valuable. So there's a kind of set of human metrics that are measurable by proxy, for sure, but are invaluable as concepts. And, that's how I would think about it. What are the human metrics? Remembering that your software, for example, is not a technology problem, it's a people problem.
Yeah.
What are the human metrics that you should strive to make part of the consciousness of the team? And then to the extent that you can sample those or or measuring by proxy, that's all well worthwhile. In business, we tend to it's a cliche, but, measure that which is measurable, rather than that which is important. I would urge not to worry too much about how measurable and graphable is frustration or agency, but you will know by walking the floor, by talking to your frontline people, by setting up forums where they can complain about the business safely. You will know where these levels are.
Yeah. So many people that I saw when I was starting up, that I work with now, they start a company because they're really interested in solving a problem, or they're really excited about it, or they've got a really good idea. And it's almost the whole, now I have people. It's sort of like you woke up one day and it's like, how the hell did this whole company thing happen around me? And that the fact that happens at multiple stages is, it must be quite interesting as you go. Tom, who I spoke with a week or two back, he's now at 100, and he was saying at 40 they had to change everything, and I was kind of thinking, 100, you probably will again. Yes. So I know somebody else who's just lived through that phase, and they've now got an office in New York, an office in Sydney, an office in London, and that's killing them as they adapt to that whole process in its different ways. I guess if you're at 100, you must be robust enough from a financial perspective to be able to start bringing in a level of experience that's probably 2 or 3 businesses past your own. Is there a way that younger businesses perhaps can tap into some of that stuff before they can afford it? And how do they make sure that they're ready to hear what they need to hear?
It's like all these questions, there are pros and cons to every such decision, or there are dangers with every decision. So before we address the direct question, let's consider this idea of bringing in people that are 2 or 3 scale levels beyond. I would say maybe 1 or at most 2 scale levels beyond is safer, because it's just as hard for a software engineering director at Google to scale down as it is for someone to scale up. And you see a lot of people at that level who have operated, for example, Google's best practice software development, but never implemented it. What your business needs is someone who can say, where are we today? What does Google look like next? Let's go through a transformation. It's a different set of skills. So often you'll see people come in and fail to scale down. So you've got to just be a little bit careful with that. That said, absolutely bringing in people at the next level above, who are not so far away from your current reality, is often absolutely the right thing to do. The problem that you find, of course, is that there's not enough of them, and if you can solve the there's not enough of them problem, then you're going to probably do well as a company. So consider, for example, we're happening in Scotland for this discussion. There's not hundreds of $1 billion companies, so there's not a huge number of people you can hire locally to address that problem. And we can lament that, or we can adapt and embrace the reality we're in. So I think in this modern age where there's a huge amount of best practice information on the internet that we can access instantaneously, the best way to deal with this issue before you can afford to bring in somebody from one of these other companies that's got a track record is to grow your own people. Now, that's an obvious statement, of course, but what I mean by that is it is possible to turn your people outward, to really instill in them a very strong impetus to learn almost maniacally about how things are done in the next bigger companies, to phone those companies up and go and see them, to do that networking, and not in your local area where everybody's the same size as you, but wherever you have to go. And it's relatively cheap to do it. I've found Silicon Valley companies are quite willing to share with other companies because there's actually quite a good community in tech, as you very well know. But your people have to be looking outwards and striving to seek out best practice. We've talked here about how companies scale, but the as important, if not more important thing, is that we as individuals also go through personal inflection points. And it feels pretty rough when you're going through one. You feel like a failure and all that stuff. You feel like you're at the bottom of a a pit, so it can only be down.
Stop it, you're going to make me cry.
Yeah. But the metaphor I prefer to use there is, in those moments, you're not at the bottom of a pit, you're actually in a cocoon. It's just as dark, but you're very much closer to getting out of it. So you will hit those moments when you go through this leadership journey, but I would strongly recommend that when you're in those moments and pre and post them, that you maniacally learn from everything you can about people at the next level of scale. And if everybody in your company is doing that, or even 30% of them, then you will probably find that takes you a long way before you really need to bring in, a lot of other people. And maybe you never will have to.
And that's a really good point, that you need to give the permission for that. You need to create the structure for that. You need to make that not just as okay, but even more okay than that you're going to go to a conference. Mm-hmm. I have a little bit of frustration with conferences. They're often very passive learning packaged up in sales events. And the best things that I've learned from exactly, I went on this really good trip to Silicon Valley, 8-9 days. And during that time, we spent a morning or a day at places. I went to like Eventbrite, and Julia Hart's CEO there kind of hosted us and talked about stuff. We went to Nextdoor, which was just brilliant, where they talked about how they'd raised all this money, then realised that their idea was never going to work, and then had to spend the next sort of like 12 weeks coming up with a better idea, or they were going to have to give their $100 million back to the investors. Just all of this kind of stuff, going to LinkedIn and seeing how they recruit versus Google across the parking lot. I mean, a very big parking lot, but how they do it. And it was really, really interesting. It's one of those things where it would solve so many problems to actually be really systematic about that. It would expand your talent pools. It would expand your skills. It would bring so much into your companies and as individuals. Because, I think often startups are terrible places for personal development. Your professional skills get honed down a certain path because you're having to teach yourself everything. But that includes all the bad habits that you teach yourself. There's very rarely somebody there to show you a better way how to do it, because you're all making everything up. So that's actually, I really like that idea. I think that's one that definitely people listening implement.
Yes, because you've got, mathematically speaking, you want to avoid local optima. And your company is a local optima. You've got to have that look outside. It's not done as often as it should be, because a lot of people are so busy trying to get today's job done, and that's very understandable. But it's absolutely vital. And if you do it well, I remember, to take Skyscanner as an example, that many of our directors, had they left Skyscanner and we tried to hire them back, we couldn't have afforded them at three times the price. But when they started in Skyscanner, they were far more junior, far more inexperienced. But by their great discipline in reinventing themselves and learning from everywhere, and by the company trying to create that kind of environment, we got world-class people who maybe didn't think they were world-class at the start, but they absolutely were. So that's important, because it will take you a lot further. And it's very difficult to bring a senior person in to your company. And when it works really well, but just as often it doesn't work for a whole bunch of reasons. So companies should look as much into their own group of people as they do outside, and set an expectation of world-class excellence. It's not good enough to be the best manager in your country. You've got to set a world-class standard. And if you set that, people respond to it, and it can take you a very, very long way.
That's probably one of the more actionable things that I've heard in that context, because it's really difficult to think, how do you help your people develop themselves? When you don't have a vast budget, but also when formal training. I tried getting people coached and all that kind of thing, but a lot of that is really very corporate orientated, and it doesn't fit the reality of what their working world looks like. And I think most of the investment in, especially early stage, is entirely in the founder, is entirely in the CEO, which is a pressure and not the best place entirely to focus there, especially if they're not being enabled with the skills to put that through the rest of the organisation. So I'm mindful of the time, but do you think there's a particular thing that the companies that crash and burn at each of these inflection points fail to do. Is there a sort of a set of indicators that, as you look back on performance and go, you know what, it was almost inevitable that they were going to overshoot, they weren't going to lift, they were just going to crash and burn at this phase because they didn't X?
But yes, I mean, there's a lot that could be said about that, but I think the generic issue is a failure to step back from activity and say, how does this look from a distance?
Uh-huh.
We tend to enjoy being active, and activity is a great distraction from reality. So, be it the fact that your product doesn't fit the market or the organisation's not working anymore, our solution is usually to get on with the job. And if a business can stand back regularly and say, not just what are we doing, but how are we doing it, and face that problem in a very kind of unmodified, sort of softened way, it's likely to do a lot better than if it avoids those discussions and those reflections.
I think what you're kind of saying in a lot of this is you've got to stop and apply your brain and stop throwing activity at it, because activity is actually making everything worse. Stop, observe, and reposition.
Activity is the enemy of reality.
I love that.
So we do need to stop what feels comforting to look at what good is. And it's very hard to do it. You've got a board meeting next week and slides to prepare, and there's a hiring meeting next. But you've got to craft out that time. And I'd summarise it by just saying how you do something is as important as what you do. But we typically see in governance, in formal and informal, that there's an awful lot of time on what and no time on how. And that's the thing I think we all need to try and bring back into the discussion.
Fabulous. And if that was ever a theme for this podcast, let's get to some how here. Enough with the advice already. Just tell me how I do it. Thank you very much, Mark. You've been listening to Vicky Brock and Mark Logan, this week's Entrepreneur Agony Aunts. You can subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or at vickybrock.com/podcast.